Thank you very much for being here. I wish you a warm welcome to this last lecture of our public lecture fall series on academic controversies in migration and mobility studies at the NCCR on the Move. Tonight, we will tackle an important, but also one of the most challenging topic for the field of migration studies, I guess, namely its relation with colonialism. For more than 2 decades now, a number of scholars have been pointing out and criticizing the nation-state and Western-centered perspective of dominant migration studies. And one of the earliest move of what is now framed as critical or reflexive migration studies was a call to overcome the methodological nationalism that is so pervasive in social sciences and in particular in the field of migration studies. And in more recent years, other types of critiques have emerged, and one of them is at the core of tonight's lecture, namely that migration studies has tended to forget post-colonial racism in its analysis. In short, this emergent scholarship is encoded around 2 central ideas. First, it claims that the history of migration is deeply entangled with colonialism, but also that the legacy of colonialism and its racial underpinnings continue to shape contemporary dynamics of migration and also the policies designed to govern it. Second, and perhaps more controversially, it is a critique to the uneven global politics of knowledge production in migration studies that is said to reproduce colonial power relations, and a related also call for action to decolonize this field of scholarship. And to address this ambitious but also controversial agenda in a comprehensive way, I have invited Lucy Mayblin, who has been working on that topic from the perspective of migration studies for more than 10 years now. Yeah. Lucy Mayblin is senior lecturer in sociology at the University of Sheffield. And as said, she has tackled the issue of colonialism very early in her career, mainly in relation to the politics of asylum in the UK, and in particular through a careful analysis of the increasingly restrictive social and economic policies for people seeking asylum in Britain. This early work has resulted in a wide range of publications, and I would highly recommend her book entitled Impoverishment and Asylum, Social Policy as Slow Violence, published in 2018. In the meantime, she had also published the no less recommended Asylum After Empire, Post-Colonial Legacies in the Politics of Asylum Seeking, in which she explores the connections between Britain's colonial past and its contemporary asylum policy. Tonight, she will be presenting some insights of her new book, this one, co-authored with Joe Turner, precisely entitled Migration Studies and Colonialism, which may well become a landmark book for a generation of scholars interested in post-colonial analysis of migration. So Lucy Mayblin, thanks very much for having accepted my invitation. I'm glad to have you with us. And I conceived this event not just as a lecture, but also as an exchange between 2 prominent scholars who are working on related topics, but from different perspectives, a bit in the spirit of the academic conversations that we have initiated with my colleague Jean-Thomas Regui at the NCCR on the Move. And when I had to think of a possible discussant for this lecture, I immediately started dreaming of inviting Pape Ndiaye. And I gave it a try and sent him an email without too much confidence, I have to say. And I received his answer about 20 minutes later, saying that he was glad to accept my invitation. So thanks very much for this, Pape. And I have invited him because I took seriously 2 main arguments developed in the book of Lucy Mayblin and Joe Turner. First, the authors rightly claim that migration studies does not lend itself to a deep engagement with history. And here I think that Pape Ndiaye, as a historian specializing in the social conditions of minorities, both in the US and in France, can enlighten Lucy's work with his deep historical knowledge of the colonial history of France and the slavery in the US, and also its legacies on the current situation of Black minorities on both sides of the Atlantic. For the French case, this work has resulted in the publication of his famous book, La Condition Noire, Essai sur une minorité française, published in 2009. Second, and also relatedly, the authors say that they do not seek to forge new theories, but instead learn from the wealth of literature that already exists outside the realm of migration studies. And on this point, Pape Ndiaye, without being classified as a migration scholar, can bring his thoughtful analysis of colonialism, empire, and racism to help us as migration scholars understand contemporary dynamics of migration and mobility. And finally, there is a last reason why I have invited him. As you may know, he's the new director of the Palais de la Porte Dorée, Musée National de l'Immigration in Paris since March 2021, I think. And I think this very building embodies the relevance of connecting the history of migration with the legacies of colonialism. In fact, the Palais de la Porte Dorée was built for the Colonial exhibition of 1931 to celebrate the French colonization. And afterwards, the integration of the Musée d'Histoire de l'Immigration in this building has then followed a tortuous path. But I know that Pape Ndiaye wants to give a central place to immigration in the political, social, and cultural history of France. And he wants also to integrate, for example, the slave trade of the 18th century in this museum. Therefore, I think the connection between migration, colonialism, and racism becomes obvious in his endeavor. And I modestly hope that this lecture and our future exchanges will also benefit him for his future activities. So Pape Ndiaye, thanks very much also to you as well for having accepted this invitation. So Lucy Mayblin will talk for about 45 minutes. Then Pape Ndiaye will discuss her presentation for about 15 minutes. And we will open the floor to Q&A where you will be able to ask your question either in the chat or by raising your virtual or real hand. I just need to remind you that this lecture is recorded and live streamed also on our YouTube channel. So if you don't want to appear in the video, please switch off your camera. Also, I will allow myself to mute your microphone during the conference in case you forgot to do it. So after this introduction, I will give the floor to Lucy Mayblin right now. I very much look forward to listening to your talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that introduction, Robin, and for inviting me to speak to you today to present as part of your series. It's a massive honor for me that Professor Ndiaye has agreed to be a discussant for this presentation. Obviously, the talk is a week late because I was last week in bed with COVID, and I'm still recovering. Really, my brain is slow, and I'm very tired. So I hope that I don't disappoint you, but I'll just warn you about that. And I might be clearing my throat or coughing a lot, but I'll hope to be perform as well as possible. So I think in this talk, I'm really just making quite a simple argument, and I don't think, even though I know that Robin talked about the controversy, this series is about controversies and somehow thinking with colonialism as being controversial, I don't think that it should. I'm really just talking, as I'm sure others here would agree, that European colonialism was of world historical significance, and that because it was of world historical significance for such a long time, that it should be central to social science research on migration today. I don't think that should be such a controversial observation. Nobody gets upset if you say the Industrial Revolution was of great significance, or the French Revolution, or so I think I want to move away from the controversy into something more of a productive conversation. So the history of migration globally is very much entangled with colonialism. Between 1600 and 1950, the vast majority of voluntarily mobile people, we might call them, originated in Europe and sought their fortunes on other continents. An estimated 62 million people moved around the European empires in the period 1800 to 1950. They were settlers, laborers, colonials, imperialists, and invaders. And then there were the massive forced migrations of the triangular slave trade and the circuits of indenture. From the large-scale population displacements, which decolonization gave rise to the movement of people from former colonies to former metropoles in the mid to late 20th century. Colonialism was all about people on the move. And it should be unsurprising to us then that patterns of mobility and immobility today follow these colonial era logics in what Stefan Mao and colleagues call the global mobility divide, or that border regimes effectively amount to multilateral projects for the regional containment of third world persons beyond the first world, as Ndiaye has argued, and I quoting her there. And yet, if we consult the indexes of migration studies textbooks today, it's very rare to find any mention of colonialism, post-colonialism, or decolonization. And until recently, there's been a general lack of interest, really, in the legacies and continuities of colonialism for contemporary migration governance and the experience of migrants and hosts, in inverted commas, today. So the book Migration Studies and Colonialism set out in part to address this. We start from the premise that colonial histories should be central to migration studies. We argue that colonialism is fundamental to contemporary migrations, mobilities, immobilities, receptions, and social dynamics. And this is something that we should all be alive to. It affects everyone, not only those who are most disadvantaged by migration regimes. It kind of shapes the context in which we are operating. So our aim was to explore what it would mean to take seriously the centering of colonialism in researching migration. So how do you properly engage with these long histories when you're a social scientist whose research is oriented to understanding the world in the present? And we approach that question, as was mentioned before, by learning from and being inspired by the wealth of literature that already exists in the world to engage with this task. Because there is a lot of literature out there. It just doesn't, or it didn't at the time that we were writing, seem to have penetrated very far into migration studies. And I suspect this is really changing a lot already as we speak, already before it was published, probably. So we wrote the book partly out of a frustration that post-colonial perspectives, amongst others, seem very peripheral to migration studies in the UK and Europe particularly, and partly because we got asked a lot for reading lists from people, especially PhD students, who are interested in exploring different literatures but unsure where to start. And they might often have had supervisors who weren't familiar with those literatures themselves. So the book was a sort of answer to that question: what do you recommend I read? A way to platform work and ideas we thought should be essential reading for migration studies, particularly. So it's a set of ideas we just think are really productive and interesting and important to think with. And our aim wasn't to spend endless pages critiquing migration studies as it's articulated in kind of hegemonic journals and conferences. Our aim wasn't to have a go at people. It was, and we have been criticized for that. People want more of the critique and the controversy, but we really wanted to produce something positive and productive to think with, not something that's primarily critical. And we don't present a new ground theory or claim that every single thing that people might want to research can be explained with reference to European colonialism. And many of the perspectives discussed in the book contradict each other and are also underdeveloped areas of work and gaps in the literature, and we don't want to smooth over contestations and contradictions. We weren't trying to resolve things into a grand theory. But there are a lot of commonalities and confluences, we think, which are really interesting and productive to think with across different kinds of literature. And I'll be really interested to hear if any of this resonates at all with the Swiss context. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on two key themes that we identify in the book, which are central to incorporating colonialism into an analysis of the present, we think. They are the critique of modernity and the ongoing racial logics of colonialism. So let's start with the critique of modernity. So this is something that cuts across both post-colonial and decolonial work, broadly speaking. And here modernity it's probably uncontroversial to say that modernity is a key orienting concept within the social sciences, within many universities globally. For most academic scholars, modernity is a relatively uncontroversial and useful shorthand. It refers to a series of events which occurred in Europe between the 17th and 19th centuries, events which fundamentally changed European societies forever. So Anthony Giddens in sociology, for example, explains that modernity refers to, quote, modes of social life or organization which emerged in Europe from the 17th century onwards, and which subsequently became more or less worldwide in their influence, end quote. So this generality, he notes, leaves the exact content of modernity and its effects open for discussion. But two things, when and where modernity emerged, are generally undisputed. And the when and the where are significant. So colonial expansion led to the proliferation of forms of knowledge for making sense of the world, as well as ways of organizing this knowledge. And modernity was one frame through which to do this. As the social sciences developed through the 19th and 20th centuries, the divisions between the disciplines often followed colonial modes of thinking about the world in relation to modern societies and conversely traditional societies. And this directly speaks to the where of modernity. Gurminder Bambra writes really well on this, so I recommend her 2007 book for an elaboration of the things I'm saying. But for example, sociology has tended to deal, as Bambra explains, with modern societies and the conditions of living in modernity, while anthropology and human geography originally dealt with what came to be thought of as traditional societies and so-called primitive peoples. Disciplines like political science and economics started from the position of understanding politics as a Western phenomenon, usually originating in ancient Greece, or the capitalist economy as a product of European modernity, and then later expanded out from this geographical starting point to be universalized. This narrative of modernity then has both explicitly preoccupied many social scientists and implicitly provided the underlying framework from which the world today is understood. So in other words, the world is often automatically thought of as comprised of modern and traditional or developed and developing societies. For migration studies, this dichotomous way of construing the world, distinguishing between developed and developing countries, or more recently, the global north and the global south, has been really important. And I'm sure you can see how many of us routinely just think in these kinds of terms when we conceptualize the world. Post-colonial and decolonial scholars argue that this narrative of modernity is centrally a concept rooted in the project of European and later Western self-understanding, which went hand in hand with colonial expansion. Understanding how some societies came to be conceptualized and thought of and imagined as modern and superior in relation to others who were understood as traditional or maybe inferior is central to both colonial and decolonial thought. But for scholars in these fields, the key thing is denaturalizing and problematizing the categorizations of the world in relation to places which are modern and which are not. So to put it another way, post-colonial and decolonial scholars are interested in exploring how this narrative has played a fundamental role in shaping scientific knowledge and dominant understandings of the world system, and also in critiquing and problematizing its use and effects. And I'm connecting commonalities between post-colonial and decolonial scholarship here, but of course there are really important distinctions which I'm sure you're aware of, or we could talk about later, certainly. So central to understanding the critique of modernity provided by these scholars are the vectors of time and space. So the temporal aspect of modernity, its arrival, is usually thought of as occurring within the context of a linear conception of time and progress, which originated with the Enlightenment. So in the words of Walter Mignolo, the present was described as modern and civilized and the past as traditional and barbarian. The more you go towards the past, the closer you get to nature. The point here is to start seeing this as one way of thinking about the world over time, but it's not the only way, and it's not unproblematic, of course. Europe, therefore, is understood as having progressed from nature through tradition to enlightenment, while others did not. But because progress towards modernity occurs within a linear conception of time, Europe and the global north, which often becomes a shorthand for the metropoles and the settler colonies, will always be ahead. If others accelerate, they might catch up. So achievement of modernity is a kind of long drawn out race in this imaginary. Walter Mignolo draws our attention to the fact that in the first centuries of colonialism, the difference between colonial conqueror and the objects of conquest was articulated in terms of barbarism. Others, he says, were barbarians. But with the development of through the Enlightenment following Hegel with ideas of linear time and thus progress from barbarism, barbarians came to be thought of as primitives. Primitives are still barbarians, but they're very specifically defined in temporal terms as being of the past and capable of change through enlightenment and civilization into the future. So all of this is clearly a colonial discourse, which makes sense primarily from a particular perspective, from the perspective of the colonizer. But over time and into the present, the concept of linear time has facilitated the classification of cultural differences according to people's proximity to either modernity, which represents the present and the future, or tradition, which represents the past. But as we know from Said and others, places elsewhere to the Western Academy only exist in these ways to the extent that Occidentals understand them as such. The Orient only exists in the minds and works of Occidentals. Spatially, as Homi Bhabha, but also Gominda Bambra and others have argued, modernity first emerged in Europe as a way of making sense of perceived changes that were happening there in relation to elsewhere. The self-conception of Europeans as modern, therefore, depends on the conceptualization of other places as not modern. Of course, a lot of this development wasn't endogenously produced. It depended on huge revenues from the slave trade and from the use of slave and indentured labor, on revenues from colonial taxation, on the subjugation of colonized people, industries, and lands. So colonialism and coloniality, which is a kind of a colonial mindset and worldview, went hand in hand with the emergence of this idea of modernity. As Anibal Cajano explains, modernity was colonial from its point of departure. Capitalism, for example, didn't endogenously emerge in Europe as a consequence of Enlightenment, rationalism, and industrial development. Rather, slavery and colonialism produced a concentration of wealth in European societies, which funded the Industrial Revolution, allowed for global trading dominance, and also offered technological inspiration for the emerging industries. The emergence of capitalism is first and foremost a global colonial story, a story of racism and differentiation, despite the seductive power of the story of inherent European brilliance. The point really is that modernity is an idea or a framework, a way of making sense of the world, not necessarily a given fact. So where and who can be modern changes over time, and this is also intermeshed with ideas of racial inclusion and differentiation. Because modernity has a racial content rooted in colonialism, coloniality is at all times imbued with a racial sorting logic. For example, Irish people are now generally considered to be modern and white, and Finns more modern and more white than Russians through joining the European Union, where previously both nations might have been thought of as racially inferior to whiteness. These common sense logics of inclusion and differentiation aren't rational, but they do appear rational to many people, including academic researchers. But thinking with modernity draws our attention to the way in which whiteness, Europeanness, Christianity, the West, occupies a semantic field with shifting emphases. It's not stable. And as Homi Bhabha, Gayatri Spivak, Edward Said, and countless others teaches, this racial sorting logic is both biological and cultural. The location of culture, as Bhabha puts it, of civilization and knowledge and sophistication, is spatialized along geographies which map onto the geographies of colonialism. So hopefully you can see how thinking with this critique of the narrative of modernity opens up new ways of thinking about migration, not only as a phenomenon, but also various people's reactions to and ways of understanding it. Where discussions of modernity possibly find their most immediate and obvious application in migration studies is in the field of migration and development. So there's debate about whether development increases rates of migration through providing people with financial means to migrate, or whether it allows them to stay in their countries of origin as a wider range of jobs and opportunities open up. But as Parvati Raghuram has pointed out, almost all theorizations of this link assume migration to be something that can be contained, regulated, or influenced, and development as normatively good. Few of these perspectives challenge the idea of development itself as a problematic colonial framework, which makes a range of assumptions around the modernity of a given society. So the discourse of modernity has been given a range of rolling conceptual proxies, which give us a language through which we might express how modern a part of the world is. In English, these include the first world, the second world, the third world, developed and developing, the global north, the global south, the east, the west, the Occident, the Orient. And rather than arguing that one of these typologies is better or more geographically accurate or politically correct and should therefore be viewed as superior to others, we understand all of these labels as shifting symbolic geographies, which rarely map on to actual places. These kinds of labels only make sense in relation to each other, and they're deployed by different actors as necessary conceptual generalization to help them and us articulate particular ideas about the world and the various people and places in it. They hold social and political meaning, but shouldn't be mistaken for real or fixed places. And we must be alive to the logics and legacies of colonial modernity contained within them, and that includes within our scholarship. So in this part of the talk that I've just given, I very briefly introduced this critique of modernity, which is really trying to help us unthink the givens of what we know. So if we can just hold that with us, in this section I'm going to talk about the theme of race and racism, how that's also tied up with colonialism and with ideas of modernity. And then I want to explicitly link that to migration. So the vast literature on race and racism as a social phenomenon teaches us that it's a system, a mode of domination, and a form of power. And as a mode of domination, it persists despite scientific developments that have proven racial categories to be meaningless and racial hierarchies to be fabrications. And yet ideas about different races hold meaning for many people in the world, and of course racism is an enduring structural force in the contemporary moment. So recognizing that race is a social construct doesn't mean that it doesn't have material consequences and shape political and economic structures and everyday experiences. And nor does it mean that the histories and power of race and racialization should be ignored by researchers. What we learned from the vast and rich body of work that has researched and theorized racism is that while understandings of race present it as shifting, contingent, localized, and multivariate, it can't be understood outside of histories of modern colonialism. For over 500 years, European colonial and imperial expansion fundamentally reshaped the organization of global social relations. That included economic production, wealth, industrialization, and human relationships with the natural world. And through the emergence of colonial scientific thought, it also shaped how we know the world. European colonial projects, whilst localized and varied, depended on the subjugation of both material and symbolic of many peoples around the world. And this is sometimes narrated in Western history, certainly in British history, as a series of benign discoveries. But colonial expansion and enrichment through the process was premised on dispossessive, genocidal, and dehumanizing violence. Warfare, disease, and outright murder underpinned this process of invasion, territorial acquisition, and extraction. And this, of course, occurred in the face of mass resistance from colonized and indigenous populations who fought and pushed back against domination and subjugation. At the same time, the material extraction from colonization shaped the conditions for industrialization in Europe. Colonies were incorporated into a capitalist system that was manufactured to benefit the colonizers. And this has continued long after the end of formal colonialism. It's embedded in the structural dynamics of today's global economy. What colonial expansion did is reorganize global relations around European capitalist modes of exploitation, labor relations, private property, and relations of intimacy and reproduction. Central to this was the deployment of race as a means of organizing and legitimizing colonialism. Race was used as a way of categorizing people in a taxonomy of humanity, as Sylvia Wynter, amongst others, have taught us. It was about understanding people as more or less human. Race shaped patterns of who was colonized and how people were treated and brought into colonial projects, for example, as laborers, as slaves, or as people, populations to be eradicated. The invention of race involved organizing human beings into a hierarchy connoting inferiority and superiority, and this intensified in the 18th century, where physical traits such as skin color took on particular social meaning alongside cultural traits and religion to code people into this hierarchy. So the idea of a common humanity born out of the Enlightenment actually relied on the denial of colonized people from inclusion in this common humanity. It was Europeans who possessed reason and history, whilst lands primed for colonial conquest were viewed as without history, as empty spaces, or merely as places of savagery or barbarism. So for Voltaire, people racialized as black were heathens and imbeciles. For Locke, indigenous Americans were nothing but wild savage beasts. For Rousseau, Aboriginal people were untouched by politics and history. The so-called rational sciences of the Enlightenment would then go on, they claimed, to discover the realities and objective evidence of racial categories and differences through the disciplines of biology, anthropology, and phrenology. Non-somatic traits were steadily coded into these classifications of who could be part of humanity and who was unworthy or in a state of infancy. In this European perspective, people became placed in a temporality of modernity as either stuck in the past or progressing towards modernity. And this temporality of development almost entirely approximated with those populations who were being colonized or would be colonized and slowly incorporated into a global system. So you can see the connection between ideas of modernity and ideas of race. And this was, of course, far from rhetorical or symbolic. For example, when the French Revolution was made in the name of liberty, equality, and fraternity, Black Africans enslaved by the French in the West Indies and the Indian Ocean were actively denied such rights. Resistance against the racialized contradictions of the French Revolution then inspired the Haitian Revolution, which began as a mass slave revolt in 1871 and ended with a far more radical model of social coexistence than emerged in France, but seems to have been actively forgotten in Europe. So what I'm illustrating here is that race wasn't just a series of prejudices, it came to be an organizing principle on a global scale through colonial encounters and was turned into a criterion of social classification for world populations and systems of labor. And this meant that in the first place, new social identities were produced. Strategies of racial classifications described the physical traits of people as somehow external manifestations of their apparent racial nature. So racial schemas always seem to end up privileging whiteness and Europeanness, but are not only propagated by white people or colonizers alone. Just as with ideas of modernity and notions of temporality, some colonized peoples have historically bought into this schema of modernity and race, and so too have many post-colonial states become imbricated within it. Race not only legitimated colonial activities, but also provided a system of knowledge through which some Europeans discovered their own whiteness and their imagined superiority as modern people. And in this way, race also shaped the organization of social relations, of identities and systems of labor within European metropoles. European society became understood as the home of modernity, rationality, objectivity, and whiteness. Against this, other societies were discovered. So European publics began to imagine themselves as white and superior, but this also structured class and gendered relations in the metropoles. So these, again, very broad-based discussions of colonialism, race, and modernity are highly pertinent, I think, obviously, hopefully, to migration studies. To consider movement as somehow separate from ideas of race and modernity is to undervalue how the control of movement and the construction of borders has historically been racialized, and how this continues to shape our present. Who could move where, for what purpose, under what conditions, was central to the organization of colonial rule. Empires were also racial projects, as I've discussed, and this was exemplified in the control of movement. So the control of movement was a key tool in the suppression of indigenous populations under settler colonialism, for example, through enclosure, the imposition of European rules of private property and contractual law, the erection of boundaries of razor wire, reserves and systems of camps and categories of tribal membership. Some of these things continue today. Being attuned to the continued social significance of race is also to be attuned to the historical continuities and legacies of empire. Colonialism may have formally ended in many, but certainly not all places, but 500 years of world history does, of course, have a legacy. So to be clear, to suggest that colonial histories have a bearing on the present is not to suggest that colonial histories explain everything that is happening today. The point is to understand how those histories, despite having been so concertedly effaced in some places, yield new damages and renewed disparities, to borrow the words of Anne Stoler. A post-colonial perspective helps us to understand why the global mobility of some people is so actively enabled, while no expense or form of violence is spared in controlling the movement of others. And of course, in making sense of this, we need also to recognize the social and structural significance of racism as a vital analytical tool in understanding what's going on. So thinking with histories of colonialism and ideas of modernity and the enduring logics of racism helps us to connect phenomena across the macro, the meso, and the micro. So from the global governance of migration, global wealth disparities, through to border and visa regimes and forms of legal and illegal mobility, from detention, deportation, right down to the intimate and the everyday. An understanding across these scales requires an engagement with history, because in understanding events today, we almost always draw on understandings of the past, even if that is as simple as claiming that today's events are unprecedented. If we commit to thinking with histories of colonialism, we're committing to much more active and explicit engagement with history, which is also, of course, time-consuming and methodologically challenging. Migration studies scholars tend to focus on the internal histories of Europe, such as the control of vagabonds, for a history of borders and immigration control. And yet, as Simone Brown so powerfully demonstrates, slavery was itself a system of mobility which shaped future projects of immigration. She explains the slave trade was a period of sustained forced displacement. So as I mentioned earlier, between 1500 and 1820, African slaves forcibly moved to the New World, outnumbered the movement of Europeans 4-1. And this created networks of transportation and mobility that laced together the Atlantic economy with the Mediterranean and West Africa, from Lagos to Bristol to Charleston. But at the same time as people were forced to move, new technologies were also invented to control their movement. So Brown shows us how enslaved people were sorted and categorized at transatlantic ports, inspected and documented in a manner that preceded and shaped the invention of paper documentation and the passport. In the plantation economy, whether in the Caribbean or North America, enslaved people were unable to move off a master's property without a slave pass. Slave hunters, wanted posters, and branding all regulated movement around racial categories and limited free movement, Brown argues. And this was organized around explicit and often gratuitous racialized violence. And in this period, the conditions of global mobility were, of course, deeply racialized. Christina Sharp talks of the horrors of the ship's hold in the Middle Passage, the dehumanizing, cramped conditions. Whilst the movement of white settlers, migrants, labourers and traders across the Atlantic was fraught with danger, they weren't subject to the same dehumanising conditions, violence and death as those who were enslaved. Instead, the passage of European passengers was oriented towards the sustaining and protecting of their life as customers, settlers, citizens or labourers, even if class and gender continue to structure those experiences differently. Writing of the contemporary crisis of immobility in the Mediterranean, P. Khalil Saucier and Tryon Woods remind us that drowning and avoidable deaths of people moving from Africa today has a historical precedent in the Middle Passage in Europe's organisation of the slave trade. They're not here saying that irregular crossings in the Mediterranean are the same as the slave trade. What they're saying is that the lack of concern, even mortal endangerment of people crossing the Mediterranean, points to a dehumanization and a devaluation of some lives, which is akin to the devaluation and dehumanization of Black lives during the 18th and 19th centuries. After the abolition of slavery, capitalists and imperial authorities drew on indentured labourers as a means of creating a pool of cheap labour in European colonies and settler colonies. This resulted in another large-scale forced migration, this time from India and China. So indentured labourers travelled under slave-like conditions and worked under contracts which often left them destitute. And significantly, as Radhika Mongia argues, throughout the 19th century, the control of indentured labourers would result in the establishment and centralisation of many of the border practices we are familiar with today. And here it's worth noting that it's not only how we conceptualise movement that is based on colonial knowledge, or that systems of global racism and inequality create the conditions for movement. Borders themselves were part of the architecture of empire. Port inspections, both on departure and arrival, expanded in this period to monitor labourers for disease and for correct documentation. The role of border officials was created to track this movement. Private companies, ticket sellers and ship's captains were also expected to monitor who was moving, and this equally drew upon and reinforced laws against vagabonds that were drawn up in Europe but experimented with in the colonies. And in this context, colonial bordering was not only about containment, but also about forced mobility, where indentured labourers could be viewed as both an economic necessity within the evolving dictates of imperial capitalism and as a social risk. So, for example, in settler colonies such as the United States, South Africa, and Australia, the influx of Asian labour was often viewed as a threat to the social sexual order of white supremacy and white nationalism. In the British Empire, even if all subjects had a formal right to travel across the empire, this was shaped by contingent practices of control, emergent forms of border bureaucracy, and informal forms of management. And in this context, internal and external borders were created to control labourers in work camps, through pass systems, through imprisonment and deportation, and in practices of disease control and quarantine. Borders emerged to police movement across empire and were tied to questions over the settlement rights and personhood of those moving subjects. In this way, borders were from their inception focused on the racialized character of movement, and borders emerged as a means of control because of the ongoing resistance of colonized people and the push to escape and develop anti-colonial alternatives. Settler colonial states in the late 1800s began to formalize and institutionalize immigration and citizenship law more rigorously around race, inventing as they did new categories of personhood. And the global system of race was captured in white nationalist moves to control who could settle in particular countries. The 1870 Chinese Act in the United States, for example, banned the movement of Chinese labourers. In the 1880s, Australian federal states began to erect the white-only immigration policy that would later dominate the 20th century, up to 1968. This was because, as elites argued, Asians were not suited to the Australian way of life. This was soon followed by South Africa, which drafted immigration law as it produced categories of race which would also structure apartheid. Ultimately, these moves reflect the transposition of what W.E.B. Du Bois called the colonial colour line into formal immigration policy within nation states. Mongia argues that the very structure of citizenship, so central to the modern nation state itself, was invented to stratify the movements and rights of people across empires. Importantly, this wasn't solely a project of settler colonies. Metropoles like Britain, France, and the Netherlands formalized the divisions of the colour line in their citizenship and immigration laws and in imperial practices of movement. This was institutionalized throughout the 20th century in the growth of immigration laws within European states, as well as in formal practices of exclusion in housing, labour market access and policing. And this culminated in moves to deny rights of citizenship and settlement to those colonised citizens who were racialised as non-white and had previously had, at least in theory, equal access to movement within empires, and it included those who were encouraged to move after formal decolonisation. So rather than viewing borders as a product of the nation state, a political project separate from or counter to European colonialism, the scholars whose work we discuss in the book would see borders and immigration control as central to the function of colonial and imperial projects. And rather than seeing that as suddenly ending, we can see these kinds of logics at work today. So contemporary systems of containment in visa policies, no-fly rules, refugee camps, and more structured the mobility and immobility of people globally, reworking categories of race. The letting die of people in various seas and deserts, the imprisonment of people who save others from drowning, the encampment and detention of racialized populations for crimes of movement, even people with legitimate claims for asylum under international law. The sheer frictionfulness of moving around the world if you have an Eritrean, Pakistani, or Guatemalan passport compared to if you have a British, Australian, or Spanish passport. The costs and difficulties in obtaining a visa, the stops at airports, the extra checks, the criminalization, it follows old patterns of global mobility control, which I think are impossible to ignore. At the same time that racism allows for spectacular violence, such as purposefully allowing people to drown in the Mediterranean, these forms of necropolitics are also structural and done quietly and conducted through institutional processes and technical procedures which are far from exceptional, but also far from the kind of still on the spectrum of violence. The point here is that racialized violence is not always spectacle, but is also technocratic, structural, and everyday, enacted through, for example, regimes of waiting in detention centers in refugee camps, through housing and labor policies, through resettlement schemes and deportation, integration strategies, or the inclusions and exclusions of the welfare state. The mundaneness of distinction and harm and its technicality doesn't stop it being any less harmful or following patterns in terms of who is seen to be disadvantaged by these systems. To help consider the impact of these histories, we argue in the book that there are at least 3 ways we should think about migration and the importance of race and colonialism. The first point to highlight is the structural and racialized conditions of movement. So colonialism shaped who could move to where, under what conditions. It structured, for example, who was a passenger on a ship versus who was captive in the hold. Enforced mobility led, as it does today, to the transformation of societies left behind and arrived at. So we need to understand this when we explore contemporary movement as well. At the same time, colonialism also created and continues to create networks of people, trade, and goods. European empires created lines of dependencies, economic as well as intimate relations of language, kinship, and culture that were global in reach and are reinforced under today's global economy. In light of this, we need to understand how people continue to move along such imperial grooves, as Stuart Hall called them. A basic example of this might be people traveling to Spain because they speak the imperial language of Spanish, or because of kinship ties, or because of histories of exploitation and dispossession that make movement necessary. So we need to ground any understanding of movement today in these historical and material linkages, structures, and connections to make any sense of migration. The second point of significance is the material history of immigration regimes and borders. We need to understand how the tools used to police mobility that continue to expand and proliferate today were created and arranged to control racialized mobility in a colonial world. Borders and the emergence of immigration practices have, from their inception, been attuned to the active dehumanization, surveillance, and control of particular colonized populations. This was their express purpose. Borders are and always have been oriented towards the blocking of the movement of some and not others, but this isn't merely an economic calculus. Of course, borders aren't oriented towards merely stopping racialized mobility, but borders reproduce hierarchies of race by distinguishing who can move and who cannot, and in that way function as a kind of sorting mechanism, as William Walters has written about, which creates ideas of worth as well as replicating historical constructions of human value. The third point is that it's not only through policies, laws, and bordering that we can observe the legacies of colonialism. It's also, as Stuart Hall so powerfully demonstrated across his life's work, through cultural products, discourses, and practices. And of course, not all of this is negative. We can see connected histories and encounters in the emergence of hybrid cuisines, music, subcultures, and dialects. In spite of the sort of logics of distinction and difference, people mix. But at the same time, media and other apparently banal cultural representations, which form the background to people's everyday lives, of people on the move and the responses of host communities to them, are all saturated with historically grounded ideas, assumptions, and connotations which establish difference as self-evident and somehow natural. And in this way, racism doesn't only invoke somatic traits or bodily traits, but also ideas around cultural difference as essentialized distinctions between different people. Nationalism needs to be seen through this lens, I think. Ideas of cultural difference are often connected also to particular territories where particular national populations are seen to have supreme claims to be at home or to be native, casting other people as out of place. Religion has been a reoccurring means of making these kinds of distinctions in different contexts over time. Everyday and naturalized claims to cultural difference are imbued with these kinds of logics of colonial civilizational difference, which often rework and emulate ideas about inferior and superior forms of culture, community, and the worth of certain subjects and societies over others. The point is that colonialism isn't just of the past, but structures our contemporary moment in a variety of ways, and this has particular salience for migration studies, and I don't think that is a controversial statement to make. The very construction of the notion of migration and the political processes that are involved in making someone a migrant have been fundamentally shaped by colonialism in many places, and equally ideas about human worth and cultural difference that shape current debates about migration are so often tied to the invention of race under empire. So just to conclude, of course, I've only been able to touch on some of the ideas and histories and connections that we think about in the book and that I think about in my own work. And I'm sure there's a lot missing from what I've said. And I'd welcome any questions or thoughts you have on these themes. The three things I'd love to know about or hear about. I'd especially love to know if any of this resonates with the work that you're doing on different topics. If you think post-colonial perspectives are of relevance to the Swiss context at all. And then particularly how we can approach the methodological and theoretical question of linking past and present in our work. Don't think it's enough just to say something's a legacy. Working that through methodologically is a challenge, I think, and it's something I'm thinking about a lot at the moment. Okay, thank you. That's the end.
Thanks very much, Lucy. It's fascinating talk. I invite now Pap and Ndiaye for a few minutes and a discussion of the book, and then we'll go to.
Thank you so much, Lucy, for this most interesting presentation, which resonates very well with my own experience on the French side, not the Swiss side this time. When basically you argue that migration studies have been slow to engage in colonial history. And the same is true in France, I would argue, as the museum I work into these days, for the longest time had a history of focusing on European migrants for the most part, migrants from Southern Europe or Eastern Europe, coming to France. France understood as the European France. And sweeping on the side migrants from other parts of the world, including Asian migrants, African migrants, and migrants from the West Indies. So one of my purpose with the opening of the permanent exhibit next year is really to reincorporate the colonial history and the history of the slave trade, that includes the history of the slave trade, into this permanent exhibit. Actually, we start with the slave trade and with the symbolic date of 1685, with the publication of the Black Code in France as a way to introduce visitors to the slave trade. That is a statement that is, I think, a way to powerfully connect the French colonial history to the migration studies and move away from the Euro-centered understanding of migrations. So I completely agree with what you've said. I also completely agree with your analysis of colonial rule as being about the control of movements. Indeed, it is about controlling movement. It is about saying who can travel, under which conditions, and for what purpose. The slave trade being one obvious example, various forms of forced labor within the African continent being another way. I would also suggest the colonial soldiers, colonial soldiers coming to Europe for the First World War, including the Indian Nepalese soldiers of the British Army, or the African soldiers that came to fight for the French army in the trenches. These are forms of migrations, temporary migrations, that were obviously organized by the colonial power for obvious purpose. So that is quite true, and I highly and I applaud the very crisp and very neat way with which you put all this. I would I'm going to focus, I guess, and maybe push you a bit on one dimension, which maybe in your book, as I haven't read it, but and forgive me if I get into waters which you have already explored in your book, which is to say that basically the idea is to also to argue that the colonial times, as well as the post-colonial times, are also moments where the resistance, as well as the anti-colonial fights of all kinds, were organized using travel routes and transforming the possibility to travel into a tool, into a weapon to fight colonial powers. In other words, I'm just taking the issue, the other way around. Instead of looking at the colonial subjects as just the victims of the colonial rule, in the sense that where their travels were restricted, were forced, sometimes in the most brutal ways, and that the possibilities to travel freely were highly constrained, which is all true, obviously. How about the resistance? How about the multiple ways with which colonial subjects circumnavigated these laws and managed to travel in spite of colonial rules? And here we could think of so many examples. I'm thinking of Gilroy's study of the Black Atlantic, for example, highlighting the intense connections between North America and Europe, with people traveling. I'm thinking of many African Americans who traveled to attend the first Pan-African conference, or the second actually, that took place in Paris in 1919, in spite of the US government that didn't want these people to travel, in spite of the Europeans who were reluctant vis-a-vis these activists. So they managed to cross the Atlantic Ocean, for some of them in very adventurous conditions. Think of Langston Hughes, at the same time, the famous Harlem Renaissance poet, who traveled from New York City to Africa in 1923. He wrote a beautiful book on his travel, Deep Sea, about how he threw away his books in the port of New York, as he didn't want to travel with books and arrive almost naked in Africa to enjoy Renaissance in many ways. And he spent quite a bit, several months, traveling along the coast of Western Africa. And there are so many numerous examples of African Americans traveling to Africa at that time, or also, as I mentioned, to Europe. So that's just one example to highlight how migration, even a temporary migration, but we could think also of African Americans who settled for good in Africa. So many did actually in the 20th, well, starting after, well, the end of the Civil War, and later in the 1920s, and later, of course. So that travel was in fact a way to express a dissatisfaction, obviously, but also a protest against various forms of racial domination, whether segregation and various forms of racial violence in the United States, or various forms of colonial power in Africa and elsewhere. We could also think of colonial soldiers, the French colonial soldiers who settled in France, in metropolitan France, following the armistice, in spite of the French authorities that insisted that they get back to their original colonies to create the first significant, let's say, Black community in Paris, and also engage into multiple political activities in the 1920s, as their political activities were definitely more possible in Paris than in the areas they came from, mostly in Western Africa. So that here the migration, the travel, becomes an anti-colonial way to express resistance, to express a protest against this. So I was curious to hear you about all this, about this side that provides an agency, obviously, to the colonized, and I think help understand better the dynamics of the colonial times, which were obviously that of the colonial rule, and obviously complete a relationship of power that was not equal. But I would be curious to hear you about this side, the side of protest, the side of resistance, and what migration means in this sense. We could also, talking about the more recent period, think about how people can also travel, how travel and how migrations can express these forms of resistance, the intelligence, the strategies that migrants, even unwelcome, and indeed they are unwelcome in Europe and in North America, can develop so as to reach a goal, so as to uh, um, do what they wish to do. So this dimension, I think, would be interesting to explore. And they in the to get back to the museum, to the National Museum of Immigration in Paris, we are also very interested in highlighting these forms of protest and activism that did not fundamentally change the relationship of power, but that made the colonial subjects political actors in the colonial times, including sometimes under the most brutal circumstances, including slavery, of course. And we could, of course, go on and on about the marronage and the various ways with which slaves, of course, escaped in the West Indies or in the southern part of the United States. So how about the agencies of the colonial subjects or the post-colonial migrants, as you rightly said, we definitely live in a colonial legacy. Last but not least, I also applaud what you said in your conclusion when you mentioned your interest in exploring the well, maybe not only the theoretical, but also the methodological dimension of the legacy, the famous legacy, which is at the heart of post-colonial studies. But what do we mean when we speak of a colonial legacy in the current times? And I think that this is quite often a soft spot of post-colonial work. The legacy is often assumed as obvious, as something that should not be explored. And I think that here there's some work to do. Similarities, for example, between a past situation and a current situation do not make an obvious continuity. So these are issues which, of course, I'd be very happy to explore and discuss with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ndiaye, for these thoughtful comments. I suggest that maybe Lucy, you react briefly on that, and afterwards we will open the floor to the rest of the audience. Is that okay for you?
Yes, thank you. You are both very tiny, and I'm like wincing to see your tiny. I don't know if I'm doing something wrong in the view, but anyway, I have two tiny, very small boxes, and I'm kind of trying to look at your faces. But thank you so much for those thoughts and comments, Pat. I think first I've noted down all your comments, so I'll just kind of go through. First, just thinking about museums, particularly because you began talking about your museum, and I think museums play such an important role in public education. I think it's similar in France to in Britain, where we don't know our history. We don't learn it in school. We don't learn about colonialism in school, British colonialism or the British Empire in school. For a long time, museums and other kind of public historical visible kind of spaces that you might go into, like kind of stately homes and things in the countryside, all of these things seem to, with such effort, ignore and silence the colonial past. And there's been a huge, I mean, I don't know how the reception has been for you, but in the UK, this is a big controversy at the moment with museums and kind of public education facilities wanting to speak about colonialism. For example, we have something called the National Trust, which owns many big stately homes, which were funded through the wealth of slavery and colonialism mainly. And you go on these stately homes and there are lots of kind of sculptures of pineapples and other colonial tropes. And for a long time, never would empire be mentioned. And the person who's leading this trust now is wanting to just have some educational conversations about that, some displays, nothing terrifying, but there has been an absolute real campaign against this person to try and get her removed from her position, to say that they're destroying our national pride, and there's been a real backlash. And I think that's really interesting and concerning, that there's such reluctance just to recognize the complex histories of our country and try and imagine ourselves as a small island, not as very recently becoming a small island, but before that being a very large empire, even from the beginning of Britain as a country. So yeah, I really appreciated hearing about that. And yeah, certainly I think there are so many examples of movement and migration through empire, and I'm sorry if my talk didn't kind of convey enough a sense of those kinds of histories of resistance, because I think certainly, I mean, there's so many examples, aren't there? Like thinking of when you're first reading people like Frantz Fanon's work, and so many scholars like that, you find out they were in France, and they were in France at the same time, and they were at the top universities and having those conversations. And I think there's so many, not just networks of people moving, but also ideas moving, like people coming together at conferences, but also letter writing between people who had connected with each other through anti-colonial resistance movements, and sharing ideas, and some, you know, unexpected places. Like, I don't know, Robbie Shilliam has done a lot of work on the connections between Caribbean Rastafari and Maoris in New Zealand, for example, and people find each other to resist, don't they, and have really interesting confluences. So yeah, and I think I'm trying to read my own notes, and in, you know, several people writing about this today, like there's a kind of a lot of work on like autonomy of migration, and focusing not just on people as victims of migration regimes, but I think there's only a few scholars. I mean, Ndiaye Achiume's work on migration as decolonization, I think, really thinking about that in a broader colonial context, and what that would then mean to think of people resisting and moving in spite or against kind of efforts of controlling movement and challenging states, but how do we kind of think about and understand that in a colonial history? So yeah, I really appreciate all of your examples, and we were very conscious in the book of falling into that kind of trap of ending up focusing on misery and kind of not empowerment and resistance. And we focused in on all of the kind of because we read a lot of work of historians, particular historical cases, and particularly like quite a few French examples actually, such as around the Haitian Revolution and the build up to that. I hope that we've been successful in finding that balance, but you can definitely tell me if we haven't, anyone who has read that. And then in the relation to the last question on methods, I think this is a really important and pressing question as well. I think you've picked up on the two kind of things that I think are important and pressing. One is wanting to draw attention to the ways in which the past and the present connect, not only in the form of control and violence, but also in autonomy and resistance. And then the second thing also of urgent thing being not kind of just getting on board with the idea that colonialism is important for the present and then just feeling it's enough to say it's the same or it's a legacy, but actually doing the work of tracing that across time, and thinking quite carefully about what that would involve. And I mean, there are some successful approaches, I think, in either taking a number of cases across periods of time and tracing particular kinds of ideas or movements or connections across those moments in time. Sometimes people have looked at one case in the past and thought about how that's similar to the present. And I think in some cases that can offer a convincing analysis too. And then other approaches have been to think about, if we seriously engage with the work of historians and acknowledge particular histories, like thinking of a specific example. So, for example, if we accept that colonialism was really important in shaping the emergence of capitalism, for example, we can't then understand the present in the same way. We're not just adding to the pile of historical case studies and it's another story that was previously not talked about enough, but we're going to add it into a pile of stories and all of them are equal. In fact, saying if we take seriously this historical case, it has to change everything that we understand about the present and have kind of implications for that. And Gurminder Bhambra's particularly takes that kind of approach. But I think, yeah, and not enough has been written about that. And it's something I'm thinking about a lot at the moment. And possibly emerges from the kind of lack of dialogue between history and sociology or social sciences. So I think that we have a lot to learn from that kind of deep scholarship, archival, long, slow archival scholarship where you go to an archive and you don't know what you might find, if anything. Yeah, it's unfamiliar to social scientists and is not something that we get trained in our research methods training and things. So I think it is something that is important. Is that okay for my length of answers, Robin? Am I?
That's perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you to both. And I think now we will give the opportunity to the other members of the audience to ask questions or make some comments on your lecture, or also on comments from Pap.
Can I just say I would
Yeah,
love it if Pap would speak a bit about his experience with the museum and the reaction to that in France and the changes that he's bringing. I think if there's time, I think it'd be really interesting to hear about that.
Of course, we can have some time. I just have one question from the YouTube audience, and I see that Christine also has a question or comment, but I think we can also give the opportunity to Pap to give maybe after, if that's okay. Pap, if you explain a little bit about your experience with the museum, that would be great. Also, that's of great interest also to me. Maybe I suggest that Christine Lang asks her question, and then I will ask a question from YouTube. Yeah, Christine, you can go.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much, Lucy, for this very interesting and inspiring and important talk and a very convincing argument. I have to admit that I haven't read your book yet, but actually it's standing in my bookshelf, but I haven't touched it yet.
You do not have to read my book. It's okay.
But I'm very interested in reading it. So, but yeah, I was very happy to listen to you right now, because I find it's a very important and topic. And but yeah, what I was actually wondering whether we have to distinguish two kind of layers of colonial legacies, because on the one hand you make this general argument that migration, patterns of movement, control of movement, migration regimes, and also like perceptions of cultural difference, constructs of cultural difference are all based and grounded in colonial history as a general historical argument. But then on the other hand, of course, we have kind of very specific colonial, post-colonial migration movements, kind of from former colonies to the imperial centers, and also specific ways of like governance of racialized others in post-colonial settings. And I wonder whether we just somehow have to disentangle these, or kind of not risk to see colonialism and kind of a general history in everything. So maybe just to give some background to my own research, because I'm researching the governance of migration and of migration-related diversity on difference in urban contexts in France and Germany in comparison. And there, kind of the lens of colonialism and post-colonialism helps a lot in seeing, kind of explaining differences in the way kind of also racialized others are located, are treated in comparison in Germany and France, with this very strong post-colonial history or post-colonial situation in the French context, compared to Germany, which also had some colonies, but we don't want to neglect this part of the German history. But kind of a lot of migration that has kind of come to Germany was not on the post-colonial, or did not happen along at least colonial geographies. So, and as much as I find this important to see to see the colonial legacies in the way migration and otherness is dealt with, I also wonder how we should incorporate this in our research in contexts where the migration and is not necessarily linked to colonial movements. So without kind of like seeing then coloniality, kind of the same kind of coloniality in everything. I don't know whether this makes it clear what I mean. Kind of seeing the colonial legacies, but not, but still differentiate into where they are kind of historically related in the general way migration is dealt with and otherness is dealt with, and where this is very specifically to very specific kinds of others and very specific kinds of geographies of migration.
Yeah, well, I think that always in the research that you're doing, you take the context in which you're working, don't you? Like theories or histories are only useful to think with if they're helping you to understand the particular context you're looking at. I guess you can certainly analytically distinguish between like literal colonial connections that mean that people travel from one place to another because of kind of particular things that structure and enable that, whether that's language or trading routes or whatever, and a more kind of broader frameworks of imagining the world and thinking about the world and the various people in it that post-colonial and decolonial theorists have thought about. I think it's not, I don't think that I think the way that I think about it is not to say that only countries that had large empires have been impacted and shaped by those experiences, and other places are immune to that for whatever reason. I think certainly it's the case that many similar ideas of who is thought of as being German and who is thought of as not being, as being somehow outside or other word used to Germanness, is connected to much broader ideas of Europeanness and whiteness, etc., which emerged through the period of colonialism. So I think that kind of literal kind of territorial association with those kinds of ideas doesn't hold up in that case. But I think, as I said at the beginning, you need to, of course, look at the cases that you have and think about the ways in which the French context is obviously in so many ways saturated by the experience of colonialism, and the way in which the German government have responded to people who have arrived there, even many invited, right, over many decades, how that's been dealt with in ways that also are resonant with ideas of who belongs and who doesn't, and who should be temporary and not, and who are seen to be able to integrate whatever, which are so similar and akin to the French case, even if German colonialism was curtailed in various ways after the First World War.
Thank you very much.
That's a nice answer. Sorry, because I'm like a bit.
No.
I feel like I'm just rambling answers.
No, that's okay. Thank you so much. I just ask one question that was asked on the YouTube channel. Just submitted to you. It's from Dalton Price, who say, although you touched on it a bit, how do you see your work in the context of south-south migration flows? Do you see it just as colonial impositions of ideas and structures like borders and policing, or are there other logics in these cases, which are also important flows in the contemporary world?
I think that's a really huge and massive question. Like south-south is so broad and general, isn't it? I don't know if I can sort of, with so little information, kind of distill a short answer. Of course, many people in the global south have are migrating between places, and there are like many scholars who are looking at those connections and relationships of where people move, and how the kind of different societies are shaped by different ideas of inclusion and exclusion, which in some ways follow, in some cases, colonial ideas. But I don't know if I can give a really good general answer across the category south-south. In my own work, I've really focused on trying to understand the British case and the way in which so much of the British kind of state's self-understanding and representation and imaginaries of people in the world, and then extending that to border and immigration policies, so much of that seems to resonate with ways of thinking about the world and people in it from periods of colonialism, and literally now people in the past few years being stripped of citizenship because their grandparents are from the Caribbean and various things. So I've kind of primarily been thinking about that, and I don't want to kind of too far reach out my expertise to the whole of the global south.
That's fair enough. I think you can just say that it's maybe research agenda for future research. Maybe we'll run out of time, but I see there's one more question, and afterwards, hopefully, we will hear Pap about his experience with the museum. Yes, I see Consuelo Flores. You can go ahead with your question.
Hi, thank you so much. So I am a researcher in the University of Osnabrück in Germany, and I was thinking about a question from Christina also, but for me, like it was it is really interesting because for me the Berlin Conference, for example, resonates so much with what you say in your presentation, Lucy, like how it constructs in Berlin. Of course, it was not Germany, it was the German Empire, but it was a reunion to really like shape what it will be the division of Africa, like to build these frontiers, these Grenzen, like to really started to make so in one sense like this, okay, that is now your belonging, but in the other sense like to build this not only imaginary frontiers, but also like constructor geographical ones. And that resonates with me because I think when I think in the coloniality, because I work with the colonial studies, when I think in decoloniality and in my work, it's for me like a really big importance, like to link and what after that. So a lot of years after was the influence of these constructions of frontiers, but of desigualities, of how is seen more like modernity, so in the sense of a people of the modern world, and who is not seen as such. For example, the constructions of what is after that nations. What Balibar says. So, and like these nations are shaped one, and that is what I think that you wanted also to answer, like how is that these nations are building in, so like in a certain, I don't know, or to name it like imaginations, constructions of equality, but to make these ideas of what is a homogeneous nation and how it is thus constructed, like in a really direct sense of modernity in Europe, for example, to distinguish them with other parts of the world. And I think that it is really important. So, or for me and for my work, that is something that links how to see migration, because if we see how is nation built, so, and how is this ideas, this construction about who is part of this nation and who is not part of this nation, we can understand the regulations that gates after that. And not only the regulations, but the different, I don't know, like not only like the migration of regulations, but also the social regulations, like who are part or not of my society. And I think that that is something really important, like to have in mind to understand migration and colonial history, like to link the both of them.
Thank you. Do you want to react briefly on that, Lucy?
I don't know if Christine wants to respond. I think that was a better answer than I gave in relation to this case. I think, did you comment in the chat, Consuelo, about the case of Eastern Europe and the way in which, was that you who was making a comment about that, akin to the German case? No, okay.
No.
Ignore that. Christine, do you want to?
Yeah, I'd love to briefly react, and it's actually it would be nice to continue such a discussion, because I completely agree with you, Consuelo, that there is a lot of colonial legacies in the ways in Germany has dealt with, not only historically, of course, with certain parts of the world where it has really been like crucially involved in shaping their geographies, and but also in the way that difference is dealt with, different is treated, and also like that's what I meant with this general legacies of colonialism that are shaping the ways migration is controlled and perceived, and migrants are controlled and perceived. But what I meant with the different layers is whether it helps us then to think of beyond these kind of general ways, then in specific, more like a more concrete, maybe also institutionalizations of these colonial legacies, which are more concrete and more deep, maybe in certain contexts than in others. So what I mean with like if we look at the way in France deals with children, grandchildren of migrants that came from former colonies, or like at that time parts of France, like Algeria, is in a way different than Germany deals with migrants from Poland. Of course, yeah, just maybe like with very simple examples, but to say that then if we think about colonialism in different types of institutionalizations, which go beyond just not beyond the general way of perceiving others in racialized ways, but which are then might in some context be very much institutionalized in rules, in policies, in histories, in narratives, in perceptions, which are more like have different layers of that than in other contexts. That's the thing that I wanted to say. And if we if we should not we should not see colonial legacies in the same way in every context, but also be very precise and very specific of how they work out, and how they function in different contexts also differently. And maybe in some contexts it's they are a lot more deeply institutionalized than in other contexts. Not saying that in these other contexts they are not at work, but in a different way. That's the thing that I wanted to say. But like, yeah, I agree, of course, with you, Consider, about the German context in that sense.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the point is not to have like just a theory of everywhere that explains everything and to kind of erase any of the particularities. It's like, I think, to do the kind of deep and complicated work of thinking about particular places and particular contexts. And that doesn't mean that there aren't similarities across other places as well, and connections and relations and interactions. But yeah, it kind of goes back to the methodological comments we were making earlier, not just to say the word legacies and then that covers everything. It's to kind of actually trace and map and think through what that means in that particular context for the questions that you're asking.
Thank you so much. Yeah, maybe I suggest that, Pap, I'm sorry if we are stealing some of your time, because it was supposed to end at 7:30, but if you can just briefly explain about your experience with the museum, briefly respond to Lucy's question.
Yeah, just a few words on the museum. I was appointed a year ago precisely to bring together colonial history and the history of migration. So I do exactly what I'm supposed to do, and incorporate the history of non-Europeans into the museum, and precisely look at migrations within the realm of the history of the French Empire, rather than the metropolitan France as it was customary before. So I am fully aware that this is something that a lot of people might find problematic or politically illegitimate, but I think this is exactly what Lucy said. I mean, it should not be controversial. It should not be controversial to highlight how colonial history and the history of migrations are deeply entangled. The other dimension of it is, as you mentioned, Robin, the Palais de la Porte Dorée is the former colonial palace that was inaugurated 90 years ago, and we need to do something with it, as this monument is right now most often seen as an Art Deco monument from a purely aesthetic dimension. And so we need to incorporate and we need to contextualize and bring history into this monument so that it makes sense for the visitors in the current times. So we are preparing, for example, a massive exhibit on the 1931 exhibit, precisely to delve in this history of colonial propaganda that was so strong and that remains as a ghost in the museum. So we need to make to explicit and to make understandable this history of the history of the exhibit, of course, but also the history of the empire. There is no museum of colonization in France. There might be one in the UK, I don't know, but there is no, like central museum of colonization in France for now. We at the Palais, we're not transforming ourselves into a national museum of colonization, but I think we need to get right into it and do what we can do, at least focus on the interwar period and the later periods, and be a point of reference when it comes to the history of the French Empire. So we are dealing with the imperial history, we're dealing with the history of migrations. That's exactly what Lucy has been working on. So I'm definitely looking forward to welcome you, Lucy, at the Palais. That should be of interest to you. And all of you, actually, please come, and I'd be more than happy to welcome you at the Palais de la Porte Dorée in Paris. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much for the kind invitation. That's great. I think we will close the session on these nice words, and I would like to thank you, both of you, again for having accepted my invitation and for this fascinating talk. And I would like to thank you also, the audience, who have been nice to ask questions, and for the nice exchange that we had. I look forward to seeing you, and back at the NCCR on the Move, we'll have another series of lectures in spring 2022, and I wish you a good evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your really nice questions.
Thank you.